I am tired of talking about affirmative action. I'm looking around the room here. I don't know. I'm 64. Okay, I might be the oldest person in this room. I don't know. Sheldon might have a year or two on me. I'm not asking anybody for the age. I am so tired of talking about affirmative action. This was the topic of the day when I was a graduate student in the 1970s. Okay, I was just at a conference on prisons and crime at Berkeley that was run by the NBER's crime study program. And I searched an audience of 150 people to find some black demographers, criminologists, economists, sociologists, political scientists in that audience, and I found 2. I don't know what the court is going to do, but I think it's a good chance that the court is going to trim back even further. I want to try to do 2 things with these remarks, haven't gotten your attention. One of them is to just try to make a few general observations after 40 years in the battlefield of what I think has gone on here. And then the other is to tell you a little bit about some research that I've done in collaboration with Roland Fryer and Tolga Uret, 2 economists whom I've done some work with, about the limits of colorblind affirmative action, which is what these slides are about. A few observations. Implied, I think, in all 3 of the preceding presentations is that this ought not to be on the student's back 100%. What we're trying to do here as a society is open up the portals into the elite sectors of our political economy to a broad range of our citizens, having experienced a history throughout the 19th and 20th century in which categorically large numbers of our citizens were excluded from realizing their full human potential. We're trying to fulfill the promise of the 1960s and the 1970s, having recognized the illegitimacy of the social order of racial exclusion by opening up these elite institutions to the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of those who had been excluded previously. That, I thought, was supposed to be the point. How did that get to be all on the backs of the students? Okay? The industrial organization of higher education matters here. Why is it that when selection is taking place, the goal is not which student can we add the most value to by admitting them to our institution, rather than which student do we predict will exhibit the absolutely highest level of performance at our institution? Because there's a zero-sum character to that latter goal. I mean, in other words, if they go to institution A and they perform high, they might have performed high at institution B. A wants them, B wants them, A and B are competing for them. But what A and B have to offer to any student is an opportunity to enhance their productivity, the individual student's productivity, and maybe the scarce resource of elite institutions A and B ought to be allocated to the students who will make the maximal incremental benefit out of the opportunity to attend those institutions. That may not be the highest predicted performing student. I mean, I hope this point is clear because it's absolutely fundamental. It's in the interest of the individual institutions to cream skim. It's not in society's interest to encourage them to cream skim. We're the ones who make up the rules here. That is, through our political activity, through our state legislatures and all the rest, through our boards of overseers and so forth. We decide what the purposes of these institutions are. That's not written in stone. Here's what I'm saying. If the battlefield is only about, shall we lower the test scores by 10% to let the blacks and the Latinos in, we're going to lose. If the battlefield is, these are scarce societal resources that should be allocated toward our posterity, what's the best way to allocate them, and are they allocating them in that way now? To which the answer is no. Of course, it's a more radical and a more fundamental critique. It's not a critique around the margins. The institutions don't mind being critiqued around the margins. You understand what I'm saying? They don't mind you messing with 5% of their enrollment, but go for the gut. Go for 20%. Go for 50% of their enrollment. Define differently the way in which they do their business. Change their missions for them. Let me give you a concrete example. I teach graduate students in economics. To a close approximation, economists train our graduate students as if we were training engineers or mathematicians, not as if we were training social scientists. We put a huge weight on the ability to do calculus. Now, I'm for doing calculus. I think it's a good thing. But I know many people who could make very fine economists who aren't particularly good at dotting I's and crossing T's. Okay? We ration them out. And when we do that, we ration out a lot of people of color and a lot of women. That just happens to be the fact on the ground at the present time. We don't have to teach economics that way. Okay? I'm not going to win this battle in a faculty meeting, I know that. Okay? But the point is, I'm trying to illustrate an example. Because on the one hand, I could say, oh, Susie would be okay. She's not as good as John, but she'd be okay. Let her in, and my colleagues might go along with it. But if I say, why don't we take a look at that first-year curriculum and see if we couldn't do it differently? We'll still be training good economists, but we'll have in more Susies and more Jamals if we do it differently. Then they're going to reach for their pistol. Because I'll be messing with the, core stuff then. I'll be messing with the self-definition and the identity parameters of these people who think they're so smart that they can do stuff that other people can't do. Well, the last time I looked, doing economics was not about an IQ test. It was about posing an interesting question, getting the relevant data, and pushing through until you had a policy-relevant conclusion from the analysis. There's a lot of people who can do that, who are brown and black and female, who are not getting an opportunity to do it now because the gatekeepers have defined the game in terms that they feel most comfortable with, so as to reproduce people like themselves. So now if we're going to argue with them about the marginal question of can we lower the threshold 10% for these people, we're going to lose. But this other argument, which I don't expect to win in a faculty meeting, but which a broad-based movement of social criticism might well put on the table and keep on the table, is certainly one worth considering. I agree very much with what was said about it shouldn't be all about diversity. I've already in effect stated that, but it has become all about diversity. And let me, with my 5 minutes that are left or whatever it is, turn to this other thing that I want to say. Let me make another comment in the same spirit, and I'll be done. I picked up my Cato Unbound webzine the other day. I logged on to my Cato Unbound. That's the Cato Institute. That's the libertarians. And I found Charles Murray on the front page. Oh. Yeah, I know what you mean. But guess what he was saying? He was saying that the BA degree from the elite institutions is the work of the devil. Quote, that's a quote. But I actually wrote it down here. The proposition that I hereby lay before the House is that the BA degree is the work of the devil. And then he goes on to say, we've got this kind of meritocratic thing set up where we ration access to, jobs by asking people whether or not they've got a BA from the right kind of institution. And when they don't have it, we don't give them the job. And he thinks that's a wrong way of doing it. I'm only mentioning that to say that distance learning and private profit, an online thing and so forth and so on, there are other ways to get between a kid that doesn't know what to do and a kid who has a skill than to send them off to Pomona or Brown or someplace like that, where only 1/10 of 1% or 5/10 of 1% of the entire population will be able to have access. So, even the libertarians, or at least some of the libertarians, some of the right-wingers are beginning to raise the same kind of question. So, in any case, let me talk now just a little bit about this colorblind affirmative. We put in, a group of us, a brief in the Gratz and Grutter cases way back when. Like I say, I've been doing this for a long time. To try to make the point that this fallback position of the critics, we don't want to do racially discriminatory affirmative action because that's unconstitutional, but we can still get diversity from race-neutral means, to try to argue that that was not really a viable alternative. And the argument that we made was based on efficiency. And it was the implication of a very simple observation, which is that in principle, of course, you can do affirmative action without racial discrimination by altering the weights that you put on the various student characteristics which are used to vet applicants. Policymaker, by altering those weights on non-racial traits, can do so in a way that increases the yield of applicants from a particular population if you know something about the distribution of that population's characteristics in the overall applicant pool. The argument is illustrated with this graph, which imagines selecting kids whose applications fall above the line, okay? So imagining that there are just two traits that an applicant can present, this is only meant to be illustrative, okay? Say test scores and extracurricular activities, and let's say that the minority students on average have lower test scores but have comparable extracurricular activities to report to an admissions office. Then a laissez-faire selection method, that's what the LF line means, looks at every application and admits all the kids who are above the line. And the level of the line depends on how many seats they have to give away, and the slope of the line depends on the relative weight that they're putting on grades versus test scores versus extracurricular activities. Okay, so that's the LF line. Everybody above the line gets in. The CBAA, colorblind affirmative action line, is altered by putting relatively more weight on extracurricular activities and relatively less weight on test scores, but still not using race, but using the fact that it's known that the minority applicants have, on average, lower test scores and on average, comparable extracurricular activities. So when you change those weights, you no longer admit everybody who's in area A, who was above the LF line but is below the CBAA line, and you do admit everybody who's in area B, and those lines are constructed so that the number of kids in the two areas are the same because the college has a capacity constraint, and the net result is that you end up with more disadvantaged minority kids because there are more of them in area B than area A by assumption. Okay, so that's the idea of colorblind affirmative action. So the way that this can be implemented then is to, in a real data set, which we actually did with the college and beyond data from the Mellon Foundation from the 1980s to sort of quantify this idea, would be to run two different kinds of regressions for predicting the performance of a student once admitted, and then for predicting the race of the student based on the non-racial traits. Okay, so that's what's represented in those two equations there. The top equation is, how do we expect the kid to perform? The xi is a vector of the ith applicant's traits, like their test scores, grades, and so forth. And then the second regression equation expressed there is predicting, say it's a linear probability model, just predicting the probability that the student belongs to the target racial group, say black, as a function of those same traits. None of them are race themselves. They are test scores, median income of the zip code that you applied from, things like that. All right. So now, if you didn't care at all about affirmative action, you just use that top equation, you predict as an admission office the best performers, and then you'd admit everybody who performed above some threshold of predicted performance. But if you're interested in racial representation, but you don't want to do affirmative action, you're going to have a slightly different problem. You're going to want to admit, to maximize the expected performance, subject to the constraint that you anticipate to admit as many as you desire of the disadvantaged minority group, and that's what equation lower Roman numeral 3 over there, inequality 3, is representing. It's saying we admit with probability AI the ith student, and we anticipate that on average we're going to generate a rate R of admissions from the disadvantaged population group, where that's the target admissions rate. Okay, so that's the kind of theoretical formulation of colorblind affirmative action, which we could implement with a data set by running these regressions. And I'm just sort of illustrating to you here what the colorblind affirmative action rule would be. The coefficients beta, estimated from the performance equation, would be augmented by the coefficients gamma, estimated from the race equation, to get a new set of coefficients that would weight the various applicant traits, and then a new threshold above which the applicant's weighted traits would have to exceed in order to be admitted. And that new set of weightings would reflect both the extent to which a variable predicted performance, but also the extent to which a variable like test score or grades or extracurricular activities or whatever predicted the racial identity of the student. So this can be done, and we did it. Of course, there are going to be incentive consequences of doing this. So for example, if an applicant is thinking, how much is trait J worth my grades on a test, versus how much is trait K worth my involvement in extracurricular activity, then the signal that they should get from the college is a relative valuation of those traits commensurate with the relative valuation of them in predicting the student's performance. But the signal that they will get under colorblind affirmative action will be distorted in the way that I show at the bottom of that panel, because the college will be using the trait both to predict performance and to predict the racial identity of the student. So we run these regressions for a series of colleges on this longitudinal data that the Mellon Foundation collected from a series of elite colleges. And we get out, let's just look at one of the College A. This is the performance equation. So this was a regression of college rank after 4 years as the dependent variable on those independent variables that are down the left-hand side of the table. And those are coefficients with standard errors in that regression. And you can see, for example, that SAT verbal and high school percentile ranking predict positively positively associated with post-admissions performance at College A, and so on. Okay, so the college that was uninterested at all in racial diversity would just use those numbers to forecast applicant performance and then admit the highest performing applicants consistent with its capacity constraint. But the race equation for that same college also generates useful information. I mean, like we didn't know that the SAT math and SAT verbal scores were negatively correlated with the likelihood that the student would be black, or that we didn't know that the father being college educated was negatively associated with the likelihood that the student would be black. In any case, we run that regression, and so we take these two different columns, the coefficients for the predicted performance at the college and the coefficients for the predicted racial identity of the student, likelihood that they're black at the college, and we combine them with the relevant weighting in order to get a new weighting that we would use in deciding whom to admit if we wanted to do colorblind affirmative action at this college. I don't have time to explain all the details, but I'm just saying we are simulating what the college would do if it wanted to do colorblind affirmative action rather than race-conscious affirmative action by altering the weight on traits that it used to admit students so as to anticipate to admit a desired number of African American students, say, rather than what it would have done without any affirmative action. And as you can see, the weight that is put on, let's just look at College A. The weight on the SAT math score goes way down. The weight on the SAT verbal score goes down. LF is laissez-faire, and colorblind is colorblind affirmative action. The weight on father's education goes way down in the equation where you're trying to get colorblind affirmative action because it's negatively correlated with the students being African American. Okay, finally, and here's the point. Let's look at how well the selection mechanism under colorblind affirmative action performs relative to color-cited affirmative action. So color-cited affirmative action is the row next to the bottom, and colorblind affirmative action is the bottom. And the number means no affirmative action would have been 100. So this is the forecast performance of the admitted class conditional on doing either cited or blind affirmative action. Okay? So, and the first point to be made from this table is that because we're only talking about a minority of the students here, using cited affirmative action does not have a huge impact on the anticipated performance of the class. Those numbers are 98, 99, 97, and so forth. But the second point is that if you go from cited to blind affirmative action, the cost of doing the affirmative action increases substantially. At College A, it goes from 97.97%, which is a cost of roughly 2% loss in predictive efficiency, to something that's under 95%. So it more than doubles the loss of predictive efficiency associated with doing affirmative action. Okay, so I'll conclude my 12 minutes with my 2 points. One is I'm tired of talking about this issue, but here we are. We really need to change the debate because we're losing this one. And the other is that it is a false hope to think that you can get racial diversity if that's what you want by using methods that don't take explicit account of race. Thank you.